Bullet ant gloves. The Satir-Mar tribe of the Amazon rainforest maintains one of the most painful initiation rituals documented by anthropologists, requiring boys as young as 12 to prove their manhood by wearing gloves woven with hundreds of bullet ants. These ants, scientifically known as Paraponera clavata, possess a sting rated at the highest level on the Schmidt Pain Index, described by researchers as producing pain comparable to being shot or walking on hot coals with a 3-inch nail embedded in your heel. The ants are positioned with their stingers facing inward, and initiates must endure 10 minutes of wearing the gloves while the neurotoxic venom causes waves of excruciating pain, temporary paralysis, and uncontrollable shaking that can persist for up to 24 hours. The ritual isn't completed with a single ceremony. Boys must repeat this ordeal 20 times over months or years to achieve full manhood status in their community. While deaths are relatively rare, documented cases exist of young participants dying from anaphylactic shock, severe allergic reactions, or infections that develop in the remote jungle locations where modern medical care remains inaccessible, with some fatalities attributed to the cumulative physical trauma endured across multiple sessions. Kavadi Autumn. During the annual Hindu festival of Thaipusam, celebrated across India, Malaysia, Singapore, and Sri Lanka, devotees perform Kavadi Autumn as an act of penance or thanksgiving to Lord Murugan, a ritual that pushes the human body to extraordinary limits of endurance and pain. Participants carry elaborate structures called kavadi, weighing between 30 and 100 kilograms, while their bodies are pierced with vel skewers, metal rods driven through their cheeks, tongues, chests, and backs, with some devotees having their entire faces impaled by multiple skewers extending up to 3 meters in length. After fasting for 48 days and entering deep meditative or trance states, devotees walk several kilometers in tropical heat while bearing these burdens, with some having hooks embedded in their back muscles attached to ropes that pull heavy ceremonial chariots behind them. According to medical reports from hospitals in Malaysia and Singapore, deaths have occurred both during the colonial period and in modern times, primarily from severe infections in the hot, crowded festival conditions, blood loss from improper piercing techniques, tetanus from unsterilized implements, and collapsed lungs caused by chest piercings that penetrate too deeply. Some devotees have died days after the festival from sepsis that developed in their wounds, making this deeply sacred Hindu practice one that continues to claim lives despite increased medical supervision at major festival sites. Flagellant processions. During the catastrophic Black Death pandemic that devastated medieval Europe between 1348 and 1350, desperate Christians formed flagellant movements, believing that public self-torture could atone for humanity's sins and persuade God to end the plague that was killing millions. Groups of hundreds traveled from town to town, stripped to the waist, whipping themselves 3 times daily for 33.5 days, representing the years of Christ's life, using scourges embedded with metal tips, broken glass, and sharp objects that tore flesh from their backs in rhythmic sessions lasting hours. Participants chanted hymns while striking themselves in coordinated formation, often continuing until flesh hung in strips and bones became exposed, driven by religious fervor that interpreted their suffering as holy sacrifice. According to medieval chronicles, deaths resulted from severe blood loss, rampant infections that spread easily among the open wounds, complete exhaustion, and exposure to harsh weather conditions, with the movement's open wounds paradoxically accelerating disease transmission during the very plague they sought to end. Pope Clement VI officially banned the movement in 1349 due to the mounting death toll and heretical elements that had infiltrated the groups, but flagellant processions continued underground in various regions, attracting extremists who pushed the practice to fatal conclusions, believing that greater suffering demonstrated greater devotion and would earn them salvation in an era when death seemed to lurk around every corner. Sokushinbutsu. In the mountains of northern Japan, particularly in Yamagata Prefecture, Buddhist monks of the Shingon sect practiced Sokushinbutsu, a form of ritual self-mummification that required approximately 9 years of deliberate preparation culminating in death, a practice that continued from the 11th century until being outlawed in the late 1800s. The process involved 3 distinct 1,000-day stages. First, monks eliminated all body fat through a diet restricted to nuts, seeds, and fruits while engaging in intense physical training. Second, they consumed only bark and roots while drinking tea made from the sap of the urushi tree. a poisonous lacquer that induced violent vomiting while simultaneously making their bodies toxic to the bacteria and insects that caused decomposition. In the final stage, the monk would enter a small underground stone chamber barely larger than his body, assume the lotus position, and be sealed inside with only a breathing tube and a bell that he would ring once daily to signal he remained alive. When the bell fell silent, attendants would remove the tube, seal the tomb completely, and wait 1,000 days before exhuming the body. If the monk had successfully mummified without decomposing, he was considered to have achieved enlightenment, and his preserved body was venerated in temples, but if decomposition had occurred, he was deemed a failure and quietly reburied. According to Buddhist records, only about 28 monks successfully achieved Sokushinbutsu out of hundreds who attempted it, with the failed attempts representing monks who endured years of suffering only to decompose like any other corpse, their extreme sacrifice unrewarded. Endurance dancing. The ghost dance movement that swept through Native American communities in 1890 represented a desperate spiritual response to cultural genocide, with participants performing circular dances continuously for 4 to 5 days without food or water, believing the ritual would commune with deceased ancestors and restore their pre-colonial way of life. Dancers moved in large circles on the Great Plains, often during summer heat, wearing special ghost shirts decorated with sacred symbols that they believed would make them invulnerable to bullets. A tragic misconception that would be proven false during the Wounded Knee Massacre on December 29, 1890. According to historical records, dancers collapsed from severe dehydration, heat stroke, and complete exhaustion during these multi-day ceremonies, with some suffering fatal heart failure or being trampled in the packed circles of hundreds of participants moving in religious fervor. The U.S. government viewed the ghost dance as a threat to their control over native populations, and military intervention during ceremonies led to additional deaths, making it difficult for historians to separate those who died purely from the physical demands of the ritual versus those killed during the violent suppression of the practice. The movement represented profound cultural desperation during a period when Native Americans faced systematic destruction of their societies, and some dancers pushed themselves to fatal extremes, believing their sacrifice would bring about the promised restoration, while others died when soldiers opened fire on ceremonial gatherings they deemed dangerous. The ghost dance was essentially banned after Wounded Knee, though some communities continued modified versions, with the original extreme form that caused deaths through exhaustion becoming a tragic symbol of resistance during one of the darkest chapters in American history. Hook swinging. Hook swinging, known as Gajan or Karak Puja in Bengal, and practiced in various forms across Hindu communities in India, Thailand, and Sri Lanka, involved devotees having large metal hooks measuring 5 to 10 centimeters inserted through the muscles of their backs before being suspended from tall wooden poles and swung in circles as an offering to the gods. During festivals, particularly around the Bengali New Year, participants would be lifted 6 to 10 meters into the air and spun rapidly for periods ranging from 15 minutes to several hours, their entire body weight supported only by the flesh pierced by the hooks. British colonial authorities in India documented this practice extensively during the 18th and 19th centuries, expressing horror at the spectacle and eventually banning it in the 1800s, specifically because of the deaths that occurred when hooks tore completely through flesh, causing participants to fall from dangerous heights, or when victims suffered fatal infections in the tropical climate where wounds could quickly become septic. According to historical records, some practitioners severed major arteries during the ritual or suffered internal bleeding and organ damage from the extreme physical stress, while others died days later from shock or blood poisoning that developed from the puncture wounds. In Thailand's vegetarian festival, a related practice continues with smaller hooks and lower heights, significantly reducing but not eliminating fatalities. And modern revivals of the practice in some Indian regions now include safety equipment and medical supervision that previous generations lacked. The ritual was intended to demonstrate absolute devotion through the willingness to endure extraordinary pain, but the thin line between religious sacrifice and fatal injury meant that some devotees who sought to honor the divine instead paid with their lives, their torn flesh and fatal falls, transforming an act of worship into a deadly miscalculation of human tissue's structural limits. Sati. The practice of sati, in which Hindu widows would immolate themselves on their husbands' funeral pyres, represents one of history's most controversial rituals, with origins in ancient India and continuation through the British colonial ban in 1829, though isolated cases persisted into the 20th century, with the last well-documented incident occurring in 1987. The practice existed in a complex space between religious interpretation, social pressure, and outright coercion, with some texts describing it as a noble voluntary act while others condemned it. And modern scholars continue to debate how often widows chose death willingly versus being forced by family members who saw them as economic burdens. According to British colonial documentation, widows would sit or lie on the burning pyre alongside their husband's body, sometimes after being drugged with opium, and attendants reportedly used bamboo poles to push women back into the flames when they attempted to escape the excruciating pain. The ritual's name derives either from the Sanskrit word for good woman or from the goddess Sati, and while exact numbers remain unknown, historians estimate thousands of women died this way over the centuries, with the practice varying significantly by region and caste. The case of 18-year-old Roop Kanwar in Rajasthan in 1987 sparked national controversy and international condemnation, leading to the commission of Sati Prevention Act that same year, though debates continue about whether she acted voluntarily or under coercion. The deaths from Sati resulted from burning alive, smoke inhalation, and the severe trauma of being consumed by fire, making it one of the most painful ways to die, and the practice illuminates the extreme consequences widows faced in societies where they were marginalized, feared, and sometimes seen as better off dead than alive without their husband's protection and status. Crucifixion reenactments. Every Good Friday in the Philippines, particularly in the town of San Pedro Cutud in Pampanga province, Catholic devotees undergo actual crucifixion as an act of extreme penance, with steel nails approximately 10 to 12 centimeters long driven through their palms and their bodies suspended on wooden crosses for minutes to hours in a practice that emerged in the 20th century and continues despite official church discouragement. Participants prepare for weeks through fasting and prayer, and many engage in self-flagellation before the crucifixion itself, whipping their backs bloody as they walk to the site where multiple crosses stand ready for the annual ritual that has become both a religious observance and a tourist spectacle drawing thousands of viewers. The Catholic Church in the Philippines officially considers this practice fanatical and discourages it, emphasizing that faith does not require such extreme physical suffering, but devotees continue the tradition as acts of thanksgiving for answered prayers, penance for sins, or fulfillment of religious vows made during times of desperation. According to medical reports and news coverage from the region, deaths are rare but documented, occurring primarily from tetanus infections when the wounds are not properly treated, sepsis that develops in the days following the crucifixion, and heart attacks triggered by the extreme shock and pain of having nails driven through flesh, and supporting body weight on those wounds. The presence of medical teams at major crucifixion sites like San Pedro Cutud has reduced fatalities in recent decades, with basic sterilization of nails and immediate wound care preventing many of the infections that historically proved fatal to participants. Some individuals repeat this crucifixion annually for years, their palms bearing the scars of previous piercings. Driven by a devotion so profound, they willingly endure what remains one of history's most torturous execution methods, transforming their bodies into living reenactments of Christ's suffering in the tropical heat under the eyes of crowds who film the spectacle on their phones. Cremation ground meditation. The Agori sadhus of India, particularly those who practice near the cremation ghats of Varanasi along the Ganges River, represent the most extreme form of Hindu asceticism, living for weeks or months among burning corpses and human remains, while meditating in cremation grounds as part of their tantric path toward transcending conventional notions of purity and impurity. These ascetics believe that all aspects of existence are sacred manifestations of the divine, including death, decay, and destruction, and their practices include meditating directly beside freshly cremated bodies while still hot, sleeping on burial grounds covered in cremation ash, using human skulls as bowls for food and water, and according to anthropological accounts, consuming human flesh from corpses as part of their rituals. The Agori face constant exposure to extreme heat from funeral pyres, toxic smoke inhalation from burning bodies, and diseases transmitted from handling decomposing remains, with deaths among practitioners commonly resulting from tuberculosis, severe respiratory diseases, systemic infections, and malnutrition caused by their extreme lifestyle that rejects normal food in favor of richly significant but nutritionally inadequate substances. They consume cannabis and other consciousness-altering substances to maintain altered states during their meditations, and some reportedly eat flesh from corpses found floating in the Ganges, practices that expose them to waterborne diseases and parasites that prove fatal without medical intervention. They refuse on principle. The exact death toll among Aghorists remains unknown due to the secretive nature of their tradition, and the fact that their deaths in cremation grounds may go unrecorded, with their bodies simply cremated in the same locations where they spent their lives. Modern Aghorists are fewer in number than in previous centuries, and the practice has become somewhat diluted, but those who pursue the complete path still face mortality rates far higher than the general population. Their commitment to transcending fear of death, ironically making death itself their constant companion and frequent outcome. Sun dancing with chest piercings. The Sundance ceremony practiced by Plains Native American tribes, including the Lakota, Cheyenne, and others, represents a sacred ritual of spiritual renewal and community sacrifice, involving wooden skewers 5 to 10 centimeters long, pierced through the pectoral muscles of participants and attached by ropes to a sacred cottonwood tree, with dancers pulling against these piercings for 4 more hours until their flesh tears free. Participants fast for days before the ceremony and dance without food or water under the summer sun, engaging in this ordeal as a vision quest and offering their flesh to the Great Spirit for the well-being of their people, making the physical suffering an intentional spiritual sacrifice rather than an accident. According to tribal histories and historical records, deaths occurred from dehydration in the intense plains heat, heat stroke after hours of exertion without water, severe infections that developed in the chest wounds, shock from the extreme pain and blood loss, and complications when piercings tore through flesh in uncontrolled ways that caused greater injury. The United States government banned the sun dance in 1883 through the Indian Religious Crimes Code, driving the practice underground and making documentation of deaths during this suppression period less complete, though the ban continued until the American Indian Religious Freedom Act restored the right to practice in 1978. Some variations of the ceremony involve dancers dragging buffalo skulls attached to skewers pierced through their back muscles, adding enormous weight and strain that increase the risk of severe injury, while the multi-day nature of the ceremony with complete fasting amplified the physiological stress on participants' bodies. Modern sun dance ceremonies continue with medical observation available, significantly reducing fatalities, though the ritual maintains its sacred character as one of the most physically demanding spiritual practices in Native American tradition, with deaths considered tragic but honorable sacrifices for the community. The practice represents a profound expression of faith, where individuals willingly offer their suffering and flesh as prayer, demonstrating that some rituals acknowledge death as a possibility, while viewing the spiritual benefit to the community as worth the ultimate risk. Famadihana. The Malagasy people of Madagascar practice Famadihana, or the turning of the bones, an ancestor veneration ritual performed every 5 to 7 years, in which families exhume the bodies of their deceased relatives from family crypts, rewrap them in fresh silk shrouds, and celebrate with music, dancing, and feasting while literally dancing with the corpses of their ancestors. The ritual itself is intended as a joyful celebration honoring the dead and seeking their blessings, causing no harm when ancestors died of natural causes, but it becomes deadly when families exhume relatives who died of plague, as the bacteria Yersinia pestis that causes pneumonic plague can survive in corpses and spread through respiratory droplets when remains are handled. According to reports from the World Health Organization and Madagascar's health ministry, plague outbreaks in Madagascar have been directly linked to the timing of Famadihana ceremonies, with the 2017 outbreak resulting in over 2,400 cases and more than 200 deaths, some specifically traced to families who exhumed plague victims. The tradition involves multiple days of celebration with direct handling of the remains, and when those remains harbor infectious plague bacteria, the close contact during the ceremony creates ideal conditions for transmission among family members and the broader community attending the festivities. Government health officials have issued warnings against exhuming ancestors known to have died of plague, but the deep cultural importance of Famadihana makes the practice resistant to change, with some families unwilling to abandon their obligations to their ancestors despite the documented health risks. Unlike other rituals on this list where death was expected or intentional, Famadihana deaths are entirely unintentional consequences of a fundamentally peaceful and celebratory practice, representing a collision between cultural tradition and public health in a region where pneumonic plague remains endemic. The ritual continues throughout Madagascar, And while deaths are preventable if families avoid exhuming plague victims, the practice demonstrates how even benign traditions can become deadly when circumstances introduce infectious disease into ceremonies designed only to honor and celebrate the dead. Voluntary human sacrifice. The Aztec civilization of central Mexico, flourishing from the 14th century until the Spanish conquest in 1521, practiced ritual human sacrifice on a scale that scholars continue to debate, with the Templo Mayor pyramid in Tenochtitlan serving as the primary site where priests removed the hearts of victims while they remained conscious in ceremonies believed necessary to maintain cosmic order and keep the sun rising. According to Spanish chroniclers, including Bernal Diaz and Hernán Cortés, whose accounts may contain exaggerations but are supported by archaeological evidence from Templo Mayor excavations, the Aztecs sacrificed thousands annually, with some estimates ranging as high as 20,000 people per year at the empire's peak. Many victims were captives taken in warfare, particularly through the ritualized flower wars, or Xochiaoyotl, stage battles specifically designed to capture prisoners for sacrifice rather than to conquer territory. But Aztec society also included warriors who volunteered to be captured, because dying as a sacrifice represented the highest honor possible, guaranteeing a privileged place in the afterlife. The sacrificial procedure involved leading the victim up the steep steps of the pyramid, laying them on a curved sacrificial stone called a tecatl, having 4 priests hold down their limbs, while a 5th cut open the chest with an obsidian blade and removed the still-beating heart to hold up toward the sun, after which the body was thrown down the pyramid steps. The Aztec cosmology held that the gods had sacrificed themselves to create the world and humanity, and therefore humans owed a blood debt that required constant repayment through sacrifice to prevent the sun from dying and the universe from ending, making these deaths religious necessities rather than mere executions. Death came rapidly, but victims remained conscious during the heart removal, experiencing what must have been unimaginable terror and pain in their final moments. And while modern sensibilities recoil from such practices, understanding Aztec sacrifice requires acknowledging their fundamentally different worldview, where these deaths serve to preserve all existence rather than simply demonstrate power or inspire fear. Thuggee ritual strangulation. The Thuggee cult operated across India from approximately the 13th century until British colonial forces suppressed them in the 1830s and 1840s, comprising organized gangs of assassins who ritually strangled travelers with a ceremonial cloth called a rumal as acts of devotion to the goddess Kali, believing she demanded blood sacrifice and that their killings were sacred religious duties rather than mere murder. According to British colonial records, particularly those compiled by Officer William Sleeman, who led the suppression campaign, thugs would befriend travelers and join caravans, gaining trust over days or weeks before strangling their victims simultaneously at a prearranged signal, using yellow or white scarves with knots or coins sewn into them for better grip. The bodies were then buried according to specific ritual protocols, and British authorities estimated that between 50,000 and 2 million people died over the cult's 600-year existence. Though modern historians note these numbers may reflect colonial exaggeration used to justify harsh suppression measures. Thuggee was passed down through families with young boys inducted as apprentices, learning that strangling was not a crime but a sacred calling, and members faced death themselves either through internal gang disputes, execution after capture by British forces, or suicide when arrest seemed imminent to avoid revealing cult secrets under torture. Sleeman's aggressive campaign involved mass arrests, extensive use of informants, and public executions, essentially eradicating the cult by 1870. Though whether Thuggee was as widespread and religiously motivated as British accounts claimed remains debated by scholars who suggest some colonial documentation served propaganda purposes. The thugs died both as perpetrators executing what they believed were holy murders and as victims of the brutal colonial response, making this a case where ritual killing created a cycle of death that eventually consumed the practitioners themselves when the tradition collided with imperial power that deemed their religious practices nothing more than criminal conspiracy deserving total elimination. Ættestupa. According to medieval Norse sagas, particularly Gautreks saga, the practice of Ættestupa involved elderly Scandinavians voluntarily throwing themselves from cliffs, called family cliffs, when they became too old to contribute to their communities, supposedly to avoid becoming burdens on their families during harsh winters or famines in pre-Christian Norway and Sweden. The term Ættestupa translates roughly to family cliff or kin cliff, and the sagas describe specific locations where this genocide allegedly occurred, painting pictures of elderly individuals choosing death over dependency in the brutal survival conditions of ancient Scandinavia where resources were scarce and every mouth to feed represented a potential threat to the group's survival. However, modern historians and archaeologists debate whether Edda Stupa was an actual widespread practice or primarily a legend, noting the near-complete absence of archaeological evidence such as concentrations of elderly remains at cliff bases, and some scholars argue the practice may have been based on rare actual events that were then exaggerated into a cultural tradition through storytelling. Similar legends appear in other cultures facing harsh conditions, including Inuit traditions and Japanese Ubasut stories of abandoning elderly in mountains, suggesting these narratives may reflect universal anxieties about aging, resource scarcity, and intergenerational obligations rather than documenting common historical practices. The documentary evidence consists entirely of literary references in medieval texts written centuries after the supposed events, making it impossible to verify how many, if any, elderly Scandinavians actually died this way. And the consensus among Nordic historians today holds that Edda Stupa was likely more myth than reality, perhaps representing cultural memory of isolated incidents or serving as cautionary tales rather than describing routine practice. If any deaths did occur through this method, they would have been voluntary ritual suicides by elderly individuals in desperate circumstances. But the lack of physical evidence and reliance solely on saga accounts means Edda Stupa should be understood primarily as legend that reveals more about medieval storytelling and cultural fears than about actual Bronze Age or Viking Age practices. Seppuku Japanese samurai from the 12th century through the late 19th century practiced seppuku, also called harakiri, a form of ritual suicide by disembowelment that served to restore honor after defeat or disgrace, allow samurai to die with dignity rather than face execution, or demonstrate absolute loyalty by following one's lord into death, making the ritual itself the intended cause of death rather than an accidental outcome. The highly formalized ceremony required the samurai to wear a white kimono, often compose a death poem, then kneel in seiza position and use a short blade called a tanto or wakizashi to cut across the abdomen from left to right and then upward in a pattern called jumonji, while a trusted assistant called a kaishakunin stood ready to decapitate the samurai at the moment of greatest agony, though not always immediately, testing the dying man's composure. According to Japanese historical records, thousands of samurai died this way over the centuries, with famous documented cases including the 47 Ronin who committed mass seppuku in 1703 after avenging their master, General Nogi, who performed the ritual in 1912 upon the death of Emperor Meiji, and writer Yukio Mishima, who committed seppuku in 1970 after a failed political demonstration. The ritual required immense training and willpower because the cut through the abdomen, while eventually fatal from blood loss, did not cause immediate death, leaving the samurai conscious and in excruciating pain until the kaishakunin's sword ended their suffering, and failure to maintain composure during this ordeal brought shame rather than honor. Women from samurai families performed a variation called jigai, cutting the throat rather than the abdomen, and the practice was officially banned in 1873 as Japan modernized during the Meiji Restoration, though isolated cases continued into the 20th century, among those who maintained the old warrior code. Seppuku represents perhaps the most paradoxical entry on this list, because death was not a risk or accident of the ritual, but rather its entire purpose, transforming suicide into an art form with specific aesthetic and spiritual dimensions that preserved the samurai's name and family honor even as it ended their life through one of the most painful deaths imaginable. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.